It's now my privilege to introduce Professor John Hare, the Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology. John is a member of our advisory board for the Center of Faith and Culture, is known of a man of great heart and deep wisdom. And with that, John, I turn it over to you to introduce our final keynote. Thank you, John.
I've been asked to introduce Onora O'Neill, and she's instructed me to call her that, Onora O'Neill, and to leave off the titles, which are many. And I'm delighted to do this because I have known and valued her work for many years. I knew her first as a Kant scholar. She was a student of John Rawls at Harvard, a place which I am learning needs to be named always with a wince. She is a leading member of a group of Rawls's students who have revolutionized our understanding of Kant's ethical writings. My own work has been shaped by her reading of these foundational texts. She has also written extensively and influentially on our obligations to those who are hungry and poor in the rest of the world. She has taken these insights about duty and applied them to our current situation of gross inequality, asking, for example, how our notions of moral obligation fit together with our notions of human rights. But the work she has done that is most directly relevant to our conference today is her work on trust. I was in England when she gave the BBC Reith Lectures, which were then published as a small book called A Question of Trust. The lectures were a sensation. People all over Britain were talking about them, partly because what she said was so sensible, and partly because it was at the same time so beautifully clear and lucid. I think we could not have a better person to lead us in our discussion of this topic. A group of students and faculty at the Divinity School, in fact, used her book last year as the first focus of our discussions in preparation for this conference, and it was a most productive and fruitful choice. I want to point your attention to the title of the conference, which is punctuated in a certain way. We haven't somehow noticed that. A crisis of trust, ? What our speaker has done is to point out how the way we put the problem generates responses which themselves can become part of the problem. The question mark is significant. We need to think about how we frame the question about our situation, because the framing of the question itself shapes what sorts of answers we then find ourselves producing. For example, this morning, she led a session on informed consent, in which she argued persuasively that we have gone down a blind alley in looking for more specific and more explicit consent over a wider and wider area of treatment. Onora O'Neill has been a model of how to be a public intellectual. She has done important work on the theoretical questions about the nature of moral obligation, but she has also been acting chair of the Human Genetics Advisory Commission, chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, amongst other examples, principal of Newnham College in Cambridge, and since 1999, a life peer in the House of Lords. Aristotle suggested, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, that there is a tension between the life of contemplation and the life of active engagement in the life of the city or state. There may indeed be a tension, but we have as our speaker today someone who seems to have bridged this gap quite successfully. I wish we had many more people like her. She is an exemplar of what it might mean to be a person of practical wisdom. So without more ado, Onora O'Neill.
John,
John, thank you for those very generous, far too generous words, because I suspect I'm like everybody floundering in the middle of a very difficult set of problems. And as I see it, one of the problems here, thank you, is that better? Yeah. One of the problems here is that it isn't as though these questions about trust are new, or even as though the issues that provoke us to worry about trust are new. Enron may be recent, but the older one is, the more one knows of previous things that have happened, and one wonders, is it just that there is nothing new under the sun? Well, I think there are some new things, and I think one of the things that has happened in the last 30 or 40 years is that we have tried to look more at trustworthiness than at trust, and that we have tried to institute remedies for actual or possible untrustworthy behavior. We've tried to find better systems for securing trustworthiness. And if it were the case that these systems are working and that they do produce more trustworthiness, and if it were also the case that if you're more trustworthy, you're going to be trusted, things might be going well. But there are two terrible questions here. First, do the systems that we have introduced, and I say we, meaning not merely in one country, but very widely, do these systems actually produce greater trustworthiness? And the second difficulty is, even if they do they lead to greater trust? In the Reith Lectures and elsewhere, I've reminded myself and others of the figure of the prophetess Cassandra. Cassandra, you remember, told the truth, but she was not believed. That's a bitter experience. And this morning, I tried to discuss one of the systems that we have used to secure greater trustworthiness and thereby greater trust, the most individualistic of the systems, that of seeking informed consent. And I argued that, as a matter of fact, that approach is of much less general applicability than people have believed, and that there are very good reasons why it has not in fact led to the increase of trust that you might suppose would emerge out of greater reliance on informed consent procedures. Now, I don't want to reiterate that, because this afternoon I want to go on to talk about some quite different new structures that we have used to secure, supposedly, greater trustworthiness, and think about them a bit critically. As we all know, discussions of compliance and non-compliance, sanctions, penalties, and so on, have always formed part of discussions of justice and the philosophy of law. But I think there's still been rather too little philosophical discussion of some of the ways in which compliance with required standards is institutionalized. I say institutionalized because, of course, you don't necessarily secure total compliance, but you might secure something. In particular, it's my view that there's been so far too little discussion by political philosophers, and perhaps by others, of the enormous shift from cultural and social approaches to compliance with socially accepted standards to widespread reliance on highly formalized structures of accountability, for which I have the good word Rechenschaftspflichten, and I think that is what I'm about. Now, the traditional approaches, and let's not be too nostalgic about them, but they relied for compliance very heavily on cultures of trust backed by very selective uses of criminal law. Many contemporary approaches use elaborate, formalized structures of accountability, which are typically backed at many points by an array of financial and non-criminal sanctions, as well as by a wider array of criminal sanctions. They're seen as a reasoned response to the supposed crisis of trust in developed societies. And many who've noted these facts now claim that trust is obsolete. They say things like, you'll recognize the rhetoric, we have eroded the social capital that traditional societies had accumulated, so now we have to do without it. In complex and sophisticated societies, the suggestion is, trust can no longer provide the cohesion or the compliance that it provided in traditional societies. Now, I think that those who hold these views typically take a rather one-sided view of trust. They tend to see it as a matter of attitude or affect. They take the infant's necessarily blind trust of his or her mother as the paradigm of trust. They have then reached the view very easily that trust belongs in one-to-one, face-to-face, I-thou relationships, preeminently in relationships of mutual goodwill, and take as its corollary the thought that beyond those intimate and personal relationships, trust is risky, those who trust are perhaps immature or deferential, and they risk disappointment if not betrayal. I think it's pretty obvious why, if you take this one-sided view of trust, it looks pretty questionable in complex institutional settings, because their relationships are usually neither face-to-face nor one-to-one, and affect and attitude aren't always the prime considerations. Indeed, generally they're not. If we were wedded to this simplistic and one-sided conception of trust, I believe it would be quite foolish to seek an end to the supposed crisis of trust. For that crisis would be a quite proper reaction to a realization that many relationships offer no basis or no longer offer a basis for this conception of trust. If it's just blind acceptance or deference or something similar, we can conclude that trust shouldn't play much part in the life of a mature democracy, in its institutional or professional life, or anywhere else where relationships are no longer personal. Now, as I see it, that conclusion is purchased at the price of accepting and promoting a specific, contentious, and fundamentally unintelligent conception of trust, whose obsolescence is then taken as reason to look for a replacement or successor to relations of trust. A typical case, if you will, of setting up a straw person for pointless destruction as a substitute for engaging with the topic in a fuller and more intelligent way. Now, those who are keen to do without trust, or say they're keen, typically hold that it should be replaced by accountability. Unfortunately, and this is the first of a number of misfortunes, they have too often adopted equally unintelligent conceptions of accountability. Some, and I think this has been particularly the case in public life in the United Kingdom, have taken a specific quasi-managerial conception of accountability to heart. Such a system of accountability is indeed a system of controlling rather than trusting, a system for controlling performance, specifically by setting targets for individuals and institutions, measuring success in meeting the targets, publicizing success or failure, sanctioning failure. Just occasionally a little bit of rewarding success happens too, but that's less popular. Now, that phrase, managerial accountability, can be read in two ways. On one view, the thought behind it is quite acceptable. It's just that those who manage must be held to account. For example, the managers of a company must be accountable to the board, ultimately to the shareholders. Those who manage a school may be accountable to governors, I think you'd say the board, and parents. And on this broad reading, of course, there's very much to be said for managerial accountability and very little to be said against it. However, many advocates of managerial accountability interpret it much more narrowly. They demand not only that those who manage be held to account, but specifically that they be held to account by managerial or quasi-managerial methods. Managers should be managed. In the UK, for example, government has sought to hold those who manage in the public sector to account by such managerial methods, including setting targets, measuring performance, sanctioning defective performance, for example, by adjusting funding or imposing extra controls. Now, the real significance of this as I see it, conflation of management and accountability can be obscured. For if it seems that all that's at stake is accountability for managers, who would disagree with that? And the adjective has, as it were, merely slipped sideways when we say managerial accountability. But that, as I've suggested, is not what is meant. And I'm going to make the point more vivid with a vulgar joke. Contrast the grammatical slide of the adjective in the very common phrase, disabled toilets. When you read the notice, you don't, unless you're chronically pessimistic, yes, the joke's already been noticed, you don't assume the toilets are disabled. You assume they're for the disabled. When you read the phrase managerial accountability, you may think that all it means is accountability for managers, but it doesn't. It actually means accountability organized on managerial lines. The adjective hasn't slipped at all. So the reasonable claim that managers should be held to account quite often is replaced by the more specific and questionable claim that they, and through them all others, should be held to account by specific managerial methods. So, for example, we see evidence of this by finding, and again I think the UK is a good exhibit here, the adoption of managerial vocabulary by government, by the opposition, by the media, who all speak unembarrassedly of government not as governing or holding public bodies to account or regulating, but of managing. Government is to deliver services, meet targets, and of course be lambasted for failing to meet targets. The accusations that we meet against over-centralization and control freakery now levied against government are just a corollary of assuming that the proper or the preferable conception of accountability should be managerial in this rather limited sense. And yet, the arguments for embracing this conception of the accountability are remarkably sparse. Contrary to common assumptions, there isn't any ready analogy with the ways in which managers are ultimately held to account by processes of corporate governance that are not, because these are not managerial, nor is an extension of managerial accountability to ever more senior managers of managers of managers in the least plausible. In effect, it approximates to assuming that central planning could, after all, be made to work. Alas, the system has been transferred initially from the private to the public sector under a misapprehension, as I've suggested, now trickles back to afflict the private sector in the form of hyper-regulation, and the UK provides a wonderful example of an approach to improving accountability that has been undertaken with the best of motives and at great energy and cost, but hasn't had the right results. If you want to see what the process has been, there's an excellent book by Michael Moran called The British Regulatory State, which came out last year, and this process is not peculiar to one political party. It's been going for 25 years, and it is, I fear, replicated and being replicated in many other parts of the world. What are the merits of this approach? Well, it said, look, it's nicely integrable with managerial process, it's cheap, it's objective, it's fair, it's easy to publicize, and it dovetails well with those new, and as I shall argue, mistaken communicative ideals of transparency or openness. These merits, in my view, add up to a lot less than you might hope. But it is true that managerial accountability integrates well with managerial process. Of course it does. It is, after all, simply an extension of managerial process, a specific form of up-down accountability, where those above set targets and those below have their performance measured and sanctioned. In that it has that in common, though perhaps not being up-down, though not perhaps the target setting, with both military and bureaucratic forms of accountability. But a central difficulty with this approach to accountability has been that most complex activities lack obvious or easily measurable targets. The targets, therefore, actually set by those who set them are typically proxies for the real objectives, chosen less for their merits than because they're nice and measurable. And the idea has been that proxy measurements provide performance indicators where the real target is too hard to measure. Much, of course, can go wrong here. Now, I'm not speaking against proxy indicators or performance indicators in general. I think there can be good ones, and I'll give you an example of a good one. Development workers in the third world very often use the upper arm circumference measurement of a child as an index of nutritional status. I'm told it's quite a good index. It has the great merit that it's very quick to measure, and there are real units, centimeters or inches, whichever you use, to measure them. But in many cases, the sorts of proxy indicators used do not involve real units. For example, they'll, quotes, add up the examination scores of pupils in schools, or the time that people wait for particular operations. And furthermore, nearly always when this is done, what one sees is that the professionals whose performance is being measured and judged then come to try to track their scores on these indicators rather than to pursue the real objective. And if there isn't a good and fundamental correlation between the indicator and the real objective, the underlying variable, then this will be, of course, a disaster. Now, it might be that if you were trying to improve child nutrition, then getting a fatter upper arm would be a good way of judging whether you were succeeding. But that's because it is a good indicator. But suppose exam scores are used, then it may be much simpler to put the children in for easier examinations or to corrupt the system of examining, something that has happened in the UK. So, in general, we find that even well-chosen performance indicators can create perverse incentives, and this is a real problem. Why then is this approach, this quasi-managerialism, so desired as a measure of accountability? Is it because it's cheap? So it's said. You substitute cheap, inexpert judgment for expensive expert judgment. Measuring nutritional status is more difficult than measuring upper arm circumference. And it's also objective. You just put a tick in a box if it's below a certain height. And then it's very easy to take these scores and be transparent about them. And then you've achieved accountability perhaps to a wider public. But the very supposed, but as I've argued, illusory ease of measurement and ease of record keeping may in the event undermine objectivity. Recording performance by requiring ticks in boxes may in the end be neither cheap nor objective nor transparent. A car, for example, is well serviced when the mechanic does an expert job, whether or not he ticks all the boxes after having done that expert job. In fact, the easy thing is to tick the boxes without doing the expert job. So management by performance indicators often has a price, and that price can be not objectivity, but loss of objectivity. Nor is it cheap. If expert performance is not eliminable, it's going to be an additional cost to monitor performance by scores on proxy indicators remote from the real tasks. The added value of this approach can be much less than its advocates suppose. Finally, even if we wish to take this view, there's no reason at all to think that we will eliminate the need for trust. On the contrary, if not ultimately based on relations of trust, managerial accountability will spiral into an infinite regress of deferred accountability unless at some point trust is placed in some claims or some persons, institutions or processes. There'll be no reason to place it in any procedures for securing accountability, however Byzantine we make them. So this suggests to me that really what we might do well to do is to look for more intelligent forms of accountability. For example, depending on context, it might be appropriate to hold managers accountable or others accountable by other systems, by democratic or corporate forms of governance, legal, financial or professional forms of accountability. This is not rocket science. There are a lot of forms of accountability that are known. We may not need to invent the wheel, but what I start with is the thought that we do ultimately need to get beyond narrow and ultimately, let's face it, stupid views of accountability and of trust. What could change if we took a different view of each? My question now will be, what approaches could we take if we are looking for intelligent accountability and intelligent trust? So first I want to say a little bit about the more fundamental idea of placing trust intelligently. Intelligent conceptions of trust, I think, have to start with the form that in general placing and refusing trust is based on judgment either of truth claims or of commitments to action. Trust in others' truth claims is well placed if their words are, or turn out to be, true of the world. Trust in their commitments to action is well placed if they duly shape the world, making it true to their word, true to their implied commitments. So regardless of direction of fit, trust is badly placed when words and the way things turn out don't fit. It's well placed when conferred on trustworthy truth claims and trustworthy action. So trust is not a matter of mere responsiveness to others. It's very rarely blind. The infant's trust in her mother is not an illuminating paradigm of trust. It's more accurately seen as a paradigm of powerlessness and dependence, which will only become trust as the infant grows. By contrast, a decision to trust a neighbour or a colleague to post a letter or to deposit some money in a bank account might be well or ill judged, or refusal to place trust in those amazing financial proposals that arrive by email from exotic places might be well or ill judged. In placing and refusing trust, we act on the basis of evidence. Attitudes and affect may or may not follow, but trust is evidence-based. And here, parenthetically, because I'm not really going into the deeper philosophical issues here, I think that trust, and with it also hope, are extraordinarily interesting propositional attitudes because they are based on epistemic claims, but the epistemic claims are weaker than those that we need for knowledge claims, but they are not, as it were, free-floating attitudes. To return to the letter that is to be posted, I may trust my neighbour even if I don't particularly like her, and I may refuse to trust other people of whom I'm really fond, but whom I know to be forgetful. There can be nothing awry with placing trust in the claims and commitments of institutions or officials or complex processes where there's appropriate evidence of reason to do so. And there's nothing absurd in refusing to trust certain claims and commitments of others with whom we are intimate. The parents of drug addicts and the friends of spongers have excellent reasons for withholding trust in certain respects, financial perhaps, despite affection, despite protestations of reform. So well-placed trust requires discrimination. It has to be directed selectively at specific truth claims and specific undertakings to act. Although we often speak in broad terms of trusting a person, we typically trust somebody for some but not other truth claims, for some but not other sorts of action. I might trust a teacher to teach my child to read, but not to drive the school minibus. So trust is evidence-based, but of course it's not based on guarantees or control. If I have either proof, where it is a proposition at stake, or proof of its truth, or if I have control of the outcomes, trust is redundant. I've displaced the context of trust. Trust must run ahead of proof or control, and it is therefore always possible to place it badly. So, unavoidably, it carries risk. But at that point, one has to say, okay, that means it matters to place it intelligently, and you have to acknowledge things can go wrong. I may have poor judgment. I may place my trust in the claims of lifestyle gurus or the predictions of market analysts. I may place it in the commitments of con artists or pyramid selling schemes. Even if my judgment's not poor, I may get matters wrong because evidence does not always track truth. and even if it does track truth, it may be insufficient. So misplaced trust is a pretty easy thing to arrive at, and whether it's one's own incompetence in judging, others' insincere or deliberate fabrication, false testimony or false promises, or whether it is just the general point about the insufficiency of evidence. Now, does the fact that we have to place trust without guarantees suggest that we're wrong to trust? Perhaps, and I think this is what some people have been thinking these last 20 years, we should bypass trust. We should refuse to trust what others say or the commitments they make. Well, the idea is plausible on the surface. Don't trust and you won't be let down. Well, that might be a reason not to place excessive or unconditional trust in certain claims or commitments. As I've said, it can be done more or less carefully or prudently, but we cannot do without trust. We need evidence, but we can't really do without trust because we cannot have an infinite regress of evidence, either for the truth of claims or for the reliability of commitments. So, if trust is ineliminable, what is the relation between trust and accountability? What I would suggest is that we need an intelligent approach to accountability. And if you have a copy of the handout, I think that you will find that one side of it, the side with lots of italics, headed accountability as a second-order obligation, may be, as it were, a helpful background thing at this point. The common, in my view, most fundamental feature of accountability is that it is constructed upon an account of the more basic obligations for which a person or an institution is accountable. From the point of view of an agent of whom certain acts are required, those acts constitute obligations or duties or tasks, whatever you like. And in some cases, of course, there will be people who are entitled to the proper performance of those obligations, duties, or tasks. Not always. Not all obligations have counterpart rights. I leave that aside. Now, obligations and rights are at least asymmetric, and that's why I've gone in via the notion of the task or the requirement, the obligation, the duty, because whether or not there's a counterpart right, one understands where one is if one knows what the requirement to act is. And it has, I'm afraid, to be said that although it's been a commonplace in most writing on ethics and politics in the Western tradition for some centuries, that some obligations have counterpart rights and others do not, this has often been obscured in the last 50 years in rights-centered writing, which commonly neglects all but claimable obligations, and yet, tragically, the contemporary rights-centered literature is not clear about the allocation of the obligations that correspond to the rights. The reverse is often true. Now, conceptions of accountability, as I see it, form a third distinct extension of normative structures. These are second-order obligations. An agent is accountable, sometimes we say answerable, for performance or non-performance of some primary obligation when he or she, often helped or overseen by others, or professional help is common here, has a further obligation to render an account of their performance or non-performance of their primary obligation to others, who in their turn have an obligation to hold them to account for that performance or non-performance. You'll find all that set out with fairly obvious formalization down the page. Accountability, too, is therefore very clearly propositional. It's a matter of rendering and receiving an account of what has been done, judging it against an account of what ought to have been done, and holding to account where there are discrepancies between the account rendered and the obligations that were to be discharged. So that means, I think, that once we've seen that accountability is propositional in that way, that you have to begin with an understanding of the basic tasks of those who are held to account. An account of the basic tasks has to be the foundation for holding to account. Sometimes, but rarely in developed societies, performance of an obligation is to right holders. A person may promise a friend to deal with a problem. The friend, we then say, has a right to have them deal with that problem, and they will be accountable to their friend for doing or failing to do so. On the other hand, within a legal order, those who violate rights will be accountable to the courts rather than to those whom they were wrong. This is a point that is entirely familiar to us, since so vividly made by John Locke in the 17th century and indeed before. Absent a legal order, of course, wrongdoers might be accountable to those whom they wrong, or to their friends and relations, who might be held to have a right, even a duty, to hold to account by revenge. In setting out these points, by the way, I've completely avoided the word responsibility because it is commonly used ambiguously in English, both as a synonym for the primary obligations or duties and for the second-order obligations to account for the performance of primary obligations. So we say parents are responsible for their children's safety, meaning they have a duty to keep their children safe. But we may say employees are responsible to their employers, meaning that they're accountable to their employers. So I just avoided that vocabulary. The important thought, I think, is that if duties, and of course rights, if there are rights, are specified propositionally, accountability for their performance or non-performance must build on those specifications. Accountability is going to be unintelligent if it's done in ways that suppress or omit an intelligible account of what ought to be done. Insofar as managerial accountability, this curious portmanteau idea, focuses on proxy indicators of performance, it becomes an unintelligent form of accountability, because that is exactly what it does. Now, some might say, all very well, this is quite familiar to us, but the great merit of the new forms of accountability is that they allow us to achieve accountability to wider and non-expert audiences. Because if we have simple numerical scores indicating the relative level of performance on primary tasks, then we will be able to publish those scores. Everybody can read a ranking. A league table is easy to read. Who came top, who came bottom, and so on. And it is, I think, clearly one of the advantages that it is easy to make this supposed information about quality of performance widely available when it's simplified. But I think it has deep problems. One range of problems, about which I've said more, and I'll say no more, is if it is suspect information, that's to say it's not a very good measure of quality of performance, making it widely public may compound the mischief. And that, I think, has happened quite a lot. Transparency or openness is supposedly achieved in this way. And I am unsure whether transparency and openness are the virtues that people take them to be. What are they supposed to be? They play an enormous part in our public life now, and they are taken to be a matter of disclosure, of placing information in the public domain, of dissemination. You will notice that all of these are not forms of communication. They are, as it were, one side of a communicative act, or, to be more precise, they are ways of appearing to communicate without attending to the audience, the diversity of audiences, the specificity of audiences, and their ability to absorb the information. Things can be made transparent, and nobody may read them. Nobody may understand them, or alternatively, other things will be made transparent and disclosed, and they will be publicized, and everybody will read them, but out of context. Now, transparency, it seems to me, is something of a false friend of serious accountability. And I don't merely mean that it has the capacity to damage accountability, though it does. That often happens when formal requirements of transparency create a second layer of perverse incentives, where transparency is taken to require institutions to publish all their working papers and internal memoranda. What happens very quickly is that candid discussion, or at least the recording of candid discussion within institutions, may be reduced. Time and energy are diverted to defensive activity. Position papers, policy documents may minimize or omit serious discussion of those options that might get a bad press, depress share prices, or provide information that helps competitors. Minutes may be drafted to support the PR agenda rather than to provide accurate working records. More may be done outside meetings, whether in private conversations, as chairman's action, or as unminuted telephone calls. I first saw this, by the way, when I was still teaching, when I was quite young in this country, and I realized that appointments procedures were increasingly being run by telephone calls, unminuted. So misplaced transparency requirements or excessive ones often damage good work on policy, sound management, institutional integrity, and at their worst, democratic process. I think that doesn't mean transparency has no value. Transparency is a very good antidote to secrecy. So if the problem is secrecy about something specific, that's a very good reason for seeking greater transparency. But very often in human affairs, transparency is not the only problem or not the only communicative problem. The trouble is that transparency by itself is usually not sufficient for accountability to wider publics. Merely, as it is often put, making information available doesn't achieve adequate communication. It works for some audiences, not others. You all know about notice boards in universities. Put it on the notice board. Equivalent to don't have it noticed. And communication that works for some audiences just doesn't work for others. So in my view, the advocates of transparency are wildly over-optimistic in thinking that mere requirements for public, commercial, or charitable institutions to disclose more and more information to more and more stakeholders will make their work more and more transparent to those audiences. The effects are fairly different. Shoveling facts and figures onto websites, very popular today, is usually not a good way of communicating, except with fellow professionals who have the time and expertise to sift and use what's disclosed. Transparency is a boon for related or rival institutions. Particularly, it has been helpful to some non-governmental organizations and to the media, that's to say with bodies with professional capacity that specialize in criticizing others' performance. But I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves and think that it is always so helpful for wider publics. Less expert audiences may be unable to find the relevant information. They may be unable to see the wood for the trees, to assess what they understand, to see what is missing, to judge how parts fit together, and they don't have time to take an active and constructive part in very many debates. Unlike carrier pigeons, information doesn't automatically fly to relevant audiences. So in the end, I think one of the main limitations of trying to make of transparency the main ideal of communication is that it takes a trivializing and unintelligent view of communication. Good communication has to take account of the specific capacities and concerns of actual audiences. That's the way they achieve intelligibility to, and more importantly, or as importantly, accessibility by those audiences, and provides them with an adequate basis for placing or refusing trust. Just distributing information as transparency requires is not enough. So I believe that more intelligent forms of accountability would begin with an account of the action that's required, of specific obligation bearers, aim to reach an informed judgment of the adequacy of their action in particular cases, and to provide the evidence for placing or refusing trust. They would seek to communicate intelligible evidence of performance and enable people to decide to place or refuse trust. That's not revolutionary, but it's not the way the agenda's been going. Now, in the other side of the handout, you will see a summary of some points that I'll now come to. And as I see it, intelligent accountability is something about which we can say several important things. I'll tell you about my slogan first. You may notice there are 3 I's. Why 3 I's? Because they are informed, independent, and intelligible. The answer is that the British Treasury had a view of accountability that was 3 E's: economy, effectiveness, efficiency. E. I thought I. And so, as it happened, the terms fell out fairly neatly. But to be more serious, I think that when we hold to account, we are trying to make a reality of a second-order obligation. We're trying to judge others' performance of primary obligations. When we are held to account, we have ourselves a second-order obligation. Those who hold to account have to be informed about the performance that is required of others. If they're not informed, if they are not expert enough, they can't judge it. But equally, they have to be independent if their judgment is to be trusted. I'll come back to those in a moment. Finally, if they are to achieve accountability to wider audiences, then they have to make that communication intelligible. Something about informed judgment first. I think intelligent accountability has to be informed. Therefore, though it begins with an account of the primary duties, tasks, obligations of those who are being held to account. Without that informed grasp, there's no way of judging actual performance. Those who hold to account have to grasp both what ought to have been done and what was actually done. Expert judgment against intelligible standards cannot be replaced by superficial scores on supposed performance indicators. Now, here we come to the real crux of the issue, which is the independence of judgments of accountability. Because all of this, of course, has grown out of an enormous critique of professional accountability in many countries across recent decades, the claim being that professionals are self-seeking, that they capture the institutions. The hospitals are run for the doctors, the law courts for the judges, the universities for the professors. Well, you may sometimes think, would that it was so, but all the same, that is the accusation known as professional coziness or professional capture, or corruption at its worst. Now, there's an old saying that those who know can't judge fairly, and those who can judge fairly know too little to provide informed judgment. I think that's an exaggeration, but the tension between informed and independent judgment is real. Do experts have too many interests in common with those whose performance they're asked to judge? Will they always judge unfairly? Will they favoritize, discriminate? Can expert judgment match the open and simple information that performance indicators supposedly offer? Well, as I see it, the accusations, the dangers of professional coziness and producer capture and corruption are real and serious dangers. But to try to remedy them by doing without informed judgment, which is what this movement of, as it were, formalized in accountability has so often done, is rather like disbanding the police because police corruption occurs. The proper remedy for corruption, capture, and coziness is to set up more robust ways of securing judgment that is both informed and independent. There are well-known ways, no rocket science either. Inspectors, examiners, auditors, other experts who are charged with holding an account must be and must demonstrate that they are independent of those whom they judge. We all know why Arthur Andersen was motivated to give a soft audit to Enron. They had a conflict of interest which quite fundamentally corrupted the independence of audit. I do not underestimate how difficult this agenda is. But then we come back to intelligible communication to wider audiences. Intelligible communication, I think, has to enable those with less expertise, less proximity, and less time to judge performance. It has to be accessible to and accessible by relevant audiences. It has to differ for different audiences. Intelligibility cannot be achieved and is regularly not achieved by mere transparency. Intelligibility is relational, transparency is not. I believe that this leads us to have reason to rethink professions, professionalism, and professional bodies. They cannot be the whole answer. Other standards are needed. But I believe that weakening these standards on the assumption that they were the gateway to corruption has been a mistake. It will be difficult to row the boat back and at the same time to improve the standards. But I do not believe that we can simply turn the clock back and say that in the future accountability will be achieved by the old form of professional judgment and integrity, admirable as that is. The forces that undermine that integrity, the temptations on professionals to cut the corner, are too great. Professional work, a lot of it is boring and difficult and done late at night and not under observation. There are always temptations. For these temptations, I suspect that a culture of trust, and that means perhaps once again being more fearful of losing the respect of our colleagues in our professions than we are of failing to win some contract or get to the top of some league table is important. I'll leave the remedies to you, but you can see the reason why I think that the agenda of accountability, as pursued these last decades in the name of replacing a focus on trust with a focus on trustworthiness, has failed, and why I think we have to move to a different agenda. Thank you very much.
We've just heard some exceptional thoughts for which we thank you, and we'll take some questions here in a moment. We've learned, if any of you doubted, that words matter. And we've been reminded to think about words and their profound import in our public life, public policy, corporate governance, and indeed in all spheres of life. And we're now forced, perhaps, as a result of this address, to think differently, freshly about words before that have become almost buzzwords. Words like performance indicators and accountability and transparency. And indeed, yes, trust, intelligent trust, and intelligent accountability. And for that, we thank you very much. We now open the floor to any questions you might have for a few moments. Please. Yes.
Presentation is really helpful. I wonder if there isn't another tension in expert judgment besides what you mentioned. If B is trying to hold A accountable but doesn't have the three I's, intelligence and independence, and has to rely on C, somebody who does, an expert judger out there, then haven't you just shifted the problem of accountability? How does B now hold C accountable?
I'm going to take a particular interpretation of that question. I take it because I think it's the most challenging interpretation for me, where the problem is that C lacks expertise of his or her own to bring to the situation. Now, this is clearly the ancient problem, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, and we cannot, I think, expect to have a who shall guard the guardians, who shall hold to account those who hold to account. And I do not think that you can get, as it were, a way of driving that regress back to the equivalent of an uncaused cause or an unquestionable questioner. That's not on. But what we can have is ways in which different facets of society are held to account in a diversity of ways. So there are proper ways, for example, for holding, say, doctors to account. They do need medical judgment, but they can also involve what we call lay judgment. It is possible, for example, on various boards, on various sorts of adjudicative processes, to combine expert and lay judgment. It's imperfect, but I think any process for doing this will be imperfect. It's nevertheless a considerable support to the hard-tried doctor in the wee hours of the morning if that's the system as opposed to the performance indicators.
I have a question about the your sense that the temptations are too great to go back to a relationship of trust that may be characteristic of days gone by. A number of people have argued persuasively, in my view, that there is some kind of social contract, at least in the professions or core professions, whereby there is actually an social arrangement that exchanges service and trust in return for professional autonomy and its benefits, which would imply then that as trust diminishes, the autonomy of the profession diminishes as well, which has a kind of self-interested way of saying that the professions need to reinvest in public trust, in the older sense, need to reinvest in the public trust for the sake of their profession and its integrity and benefits. Do you have anything to say about that kind of argument?
I think what you describe is, of course, exactly the accountability, the motor of the accountability agenda of the last 25 years, a progressive weakening of professional autonomy on the grounds that the professions, or some professions, had shown themselves to be self-interested, unaccountable, untrustworthy, and all of that. So I see this very much as a challenge to the institutions and the professions to come back on that accusation. And of course, one of our problems is generally that, let us acknowledge it, there are some rotten apples, there has been slack practice, and some of our so-called professions are remarkably poorly self-regulated. Others are much better self-regulated. One of the things that I have observed in Britain is that the least trusted of professions, newspaper journalists, are also both the least regulated and the least self-regulated. And so whereas doctors are both externally regulated and powerfully self-regulated and much more trusted. So I think there are things that any profession can do to, as it were, turn things around, but they're quite painful things, and it means dealing with lax practice in one's own profession with a severity that is very difficult when one feels a certain solidarity with professionals in one's own sort. I commend the Hutton report on the BBC's reporting that caused this tremendous rift between the BBC and the government in Britain, because the BBC, for which I have the greatest respect, and which I think and hope and trust, has actually come out of this stronger, in fact failed, in my view, lamentably in their very basic duty to secure accuracy. And even when people in middle management of the BBC had realized that Hutton had reported Dr. Kelly's allegations inaccurately, both the Secretary General and the Chairman were saying, we must not investigate this because that would compromise our independence. On the contrary, I think they had, and Hutton held that they had a duty to investigate it because we give the BBC this independence so that it shall report accurately. So there's a really interesting dynamic there about the tensions between independence and accuracy. I think that speaks to the wider adoption of one-sided views of communication. We think of the media as communicating, but increasingly across recent years, they, in my view, misconceive press freedom as freedom of expression. The charters and the Declaration give individual human rights the right to freedom of expression. They do not give it to powerful corporations.
Peter, is the mic coming through?
I'm very interested in the fact that some deficiencies or, let's say, failures of accountability don't seem to be punished. And I mean, we could certainly look at political decisions of the last 4 or 5 years, some of which have been questionable to say the least. But one thing that particularly interests me is in the United States, we have 2 cases that we could compare. We could compare the case of Martha Stewart, who did do certain wrong things. She lied and she tried to cover up her lie. But in fact, she hurt almost nobody. And she happened to be in the crosshairs of laws, so that she was punished for that and has to serve in prison. Yet I find the contrast astonishing between the case of Martha Stewart and financial analysts who knowingly touted stocks that they didn't believe in, and we have evidence of the fact that they did. And they can make a financial settlement and stop their practice of their profession and go and live on the rest of their money. And I think that something is very disorderly and out of balance here. I wonder what you think about this.
I think it's a wonderful example is the first thing. That's a really very, very interesting case in that in some of the work that I've done on rethinking freedom of the press and going back to the classical arguments in the last couple of years, I've been very, very struck by the different procedures instituted by different news organizations and more generally media organizations. So that, for example, if you look at the Financial Times and if you look at Reuters, they actually do take the financial integrity of their reporting quite seriously and have an element of conflict of interest requirements on their journalists. Many newspapers have absolutely nothing, and it is treated, I suspect, almost as rather clever to have, in effect, puffed or pushed a certain share, made a killing, and then make a little financial settlement. So I think that one of these standards that, in fact, has to be strengthened all the time is that of requiring routine declarations of interest, routine standards of standing down from reporting on or deciding on issues in which you have a material interest. And it's just an illuminating example.
Yeah, I found his question very interesting that he brought up Martha Stewart, because she's the one who I was going to mention. Along the whole theme of these conferences here, I actually dare even have the gall to ask, is there really a moral leadership crisis, in as much as just the fact we're all human. I mean, what I mean by that is if I were to go back in time and buy products before they had the FDA acts, you had sorts of vendors who did fly-by-night operations, people who clearly did deceive the public and didn't care about it. And now you at least got people like Ken Lane, people like Martha Stewart who are going to prison, and I just view that as somewhat that there's a sense of justice. You know, you'd go back before and it was said that the rich and powerful never went to prison. So is there really a moral leadership crisis in as much as just besides accounting for the fact we're all humans and that we make mistakes?
It's extremely difficult to make a serious judgment on the question of whether there is more or less dishonesty than, say, 50 years ago, more or less transparency. I've asked well-informed people in many walks of life how they judge these issues, and I think the ones I respect most would say more may come to light and more may be made of it by the media, but it is actually very difficult to tell whether there is more corruption and more dishonesty in certain countries. You know, how were the post-war fortunes made? Good question. How much do you trust the Transparency International Index? Good question. In the nature of the case, dishonesty hides, and I'm not sure that we need to make this sort of retrospective judgment. I mean, I accept that the Transparency International Index is a useful tool, but it seems to me that the real questions are practical, not, you know, is there more, is there less, is there a crisis of leadership or moral leadership, or is there not? Is it a worse crisis than in 1940, 1920, 1980? The real questions, as I would see it, are what to do about it, which sorts of structures help to secure trustworthy leadership and help to secure people's ability to judge that it's trustworthy, and therefore help to secure their ability to place and to refuse trust with intelligence and discrimination, and which don't. And my personal response to the thought we're all human, we're all fallible, yes, true, that's why we need structures and not just, as it were, worthy sentiments.
Rick, one final question, then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
My question has to do with the sources for primary allegations. You look primarily to justice as fairness, including veil of ignorance, and do you see means of finding such sources that would transfer across?
Much as I was devoted to Jack Rawls, I don't follow his theory of justice. I'm, I suppose, a stricter Kantian than Jack. One of the reasons I'm a stricter Kantian is that I take, as you could tell from some of the asides about rights and obligations, I take obligations without counterpart rights, i.e. obligations other than obligations of justice, very seriously. I do not see, as so many contemporary writers in this field do, some sort of division between those who advocate theories of justice and those who are friends of the virtues. I hope I'm both. The arguments, I suppose the strand of work that I find most useful for approaching that, which is a tough one, is thinking about conceptions of practical reason, perhaps running into conceptions of practical wisdom, that's to say both reason and judgment. Needless to say, I don't settle for a purely instrumental account of rationality, although that's indispensable, and I have no, as it were, good word for those who fantasize that they can dispense with instrumental rationality. I'm willing to embark on a long discussion of Kant and of things related to that, but I suspect now's not the moment.
Well, how about a wonderful round of applause for that?